The air grows still, the shadows lengthen, and somewhere, a truth yearns to be uncovered. Welcome to RR Stories, the sanctuary of secrets, where every creak is a whisper and every silence holds a hidden narrative. Take a seat, warm yourself by the embers of forgotten lore. Now, let us unravel another story.
The air in the concrete canyon of the city was thick and greasy, clinging to the skin like a shroud. I remember the cool metallic taste of a late afternoon drizzle on my tongue as I stepped out of the apartment building and onto the curb. It was a routine exit, a Tuesday, maybe a Wednesday. My mind already focused on the coffee shop a block away, the one with the cracked leather chairs and the scent of burnt sugar. A sudden, savage roar. A flash of blinding yellow. There was no time for a scream. No moment for a coherent thought. Just a deafening thud that felt less like an impact and more like a total erasure of the world. Then, a sickening snap, a white-hot agony that detonated in my spine, and the world dissolved into a dizzying kaleidoscope of spinning asphalt and a sharp metallic smell. Blood, I realized dimly, and gasoline. I woke up to the clinical white of a hospital room, the rhythmic beep-beep-beep of a monitor acting as a metronome to my new, broken life. The doctors, their faces grave and distant, gave me the diagnosis: spinal cord injury. Paralyzed from the waist down. The truck driver, bless his soul, was apparently uninsured and had fled the scene. Just a meaningless, brutal, world-ending accident. A week later, I was home. The old house I'd bought, with its sprawling 3 stories and creaking floorboards, now felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. I was confined to the ground floor master bedroom, a cage with silk sheets and an institutional scent. The world had shrunk to the 4 walls, the ceiling fan, and the window that showed nothing but the indifferent branches of an old maple tree. My only visitors were the morning shift, a routine that was both a comfort and a crushing reminder of my helplessness. Julianne, the nurse, was a woman with kind, weary eyes and a voice as soft as brushed velvet. She'd come in, efficient and gentle for the daily rituals. Medications, blood pressure, the agonizing process of physical therapy, and the merciful change of sheets. With her came a dietitian, a stern-faced woman who made sure every meal was measured, bland, and meant to promote healing I knew would never come. They left, and the silence returned, heavy and absolute. Day 7, the broadcast. The crushing boredom of my existence became its own kind of pain. On the 7th morning after my return, after Julianne had finished her rounds and the dietitian had lectured me on the fiber content of my gruel, I decided to break the silence. With a shaky hand, I reached for the remote control. The television flickered to life, its sudden brightness a shock to the dim room. The news anchor's face, tight and serious, filled the screen. A city on edge as the brutal murders continue. The latest victim, a young mother, found mutilated in her own home, echoing the grisly details of the past 2 weeks' homicides. Police are cautioning residents to remain vigilant and are now classifying this as a series of attacks, strongly indicating a single serial killer is operating within the metro area. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning snaked down my back. I felt a sudden, desperate need to see anything else. A cartoon, a nature documentary, a test pattern, anything to wipe the anchor's grave face from my sight. I jabbed at the channel up button. Nothing. The sound dropped for a static-laced instant. Then the anchor's voice returned, repeating the exact same words. I mashed the buttons with a frenzy, my weak fingers barely allowed. Channel down, channel up, input select. The screen only returned to the same grim report, the same sterile images of yellow police tape and distraught neighbors. It was a loop, a grotesque, personalized broadcast just for me. Then, with a sharp, final click, the television snapped off. The silence that followed was not the peaceful absence of sound, but a charged, heavy void. The unseen audience. In the silence, I heard it. The old house was built for sound to travel, and the first noise was a distant, rhythmic thumping coming from the floor above me. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing the length of the main hallway upstairs. Not the measured tread of a tired man, but a weighty, almost dragging sound, the kind that vibrates in your chest. Then, another set began. Light, almost fluid steps, a smooth gliding motion that suggested something. A person, a woman maybe, was moving with unsettling grace, perhaps dancing a morbid waltz in the empty dining room. And finally, the third set, a quick, uneven patter that sounded like a child. A frantic scampering motion that sped up and slowed down, running back and forth, up and down the wooden staircase that led to the second floor. A chaotic, playful echo in the gloom. 3 sets of footsteps. 3 presences. Hello? I called out, my voice thin and reedy. It felt like a ridiculous question. Julianne wouldn't be back for 18 hours. No one was supposed to be here. The footsteps stopped, all 3 sets cutting off simultaneously. The silence returned, more absolute and menacing than before. I lay there, heart hammering against my ribs, paralyzed by the waist down and now paralyzed by a fear that felt elemental. I waited. Then the footfalls resumed, and this time they were all moving in a single, terrifying direction, towards my room. The heavy steps, slow and resonant, were drawing closer to the hall outside. The light, fluid steps seemed to be gliding down the main stairs. The small, frantic patter was the quickest, its sound now clearly originating from the top of the short flight of stairs leading to the ground floor landing, a playful race towards my door. Closer. Closer. The floorboards outside my room gave a final, loud groan under the weight of the heavy tread. They stopped. All 3 presences were now just outside the oak door. I could hear nothing, no breath, no rustle of clothing, just a profound, agonizing stillness. Then the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, the door moved inward, just a crack, a sliver of blackness perfect for a single eye to peep through. I braced myself, my eyes wide and unblinking, preparing for the monstrous face, the grotesque apparition that was surely about to reveal itself. The door swung fully open with a soft sigh of displaced air. Julianne. She stood there, silhouetted against the hall light, holding a forgotten sheaf of papers. She looked tired, her brow furrowed. "Mr. Jacobs? I'm so sorry I forgot your pain medication dosage chart." "Did you call out?" she asked, stepping inside. I stared at her, then back at the empty hallway behind her. The feeling of the 3 presences had vanished instantly, like smoke in a strong wind. I felt a wave of cold relief and burning humiliation. "No," I mumbled, forcing a weak smile. "Must have been dreaming." "Bad dreams." She gave me a sympathetic look. "Try to rest, sir. I'll see you tomorrow morning." She placed the chart on my bedside table and left, closing the door softly. I lay back, the adrenaline draining away, leaving me shaky and exhausted. Just imagination. The news report, the boredom, the pain, the loneliness, it had all combined into a waking nightmare. It was nothing. I was fine. I closed my eyes and tried to believe it, but that night, the air in my room dropped to a temperature that felt impossible. The sound of faint, chattering teeth began, echoing from the wall opposite my bed, and the haunting began. The first ghost was making its presence known, the frost-smitten child. I had dismissed Julianne's accidental return as a rational explanation for the footsteps, a convenient dismissal of the creeping dread that had begun to infest my house. But as the hours of that first night bled into each other, the comfort of that logic began to unravel, replaced by a cold, insidious terror. It started subtly. A drop in temperature that wasn't right. My room, usually kept at a comfortable 70 degrees, began to feel like a walk-in freezer. I pulled the blankets higher, but the chill permeated the fabric, seeping into my bones. My breath plumed in the air before me, a ghostly mist in my own bedroom. Then came the sound, a faint, almost imperceptible chattering, like tiny teeth clicking together, began to echo from the wall opposite my bed. It was a rhythmic, delicate sound, but it carried an unnerving quality, a fragility that spoke of profound cold and discomfort. It was the sound of someone, or something, desperately trying to get warm. I tried to tell myself it was the old house settling, the wind whistling through a cracked window pane, but the chattering seemed to move, closer one moment, further the next, as if whatever was making the sound was restless, unable to find peace. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. My words vanished in the frigid air, leaving no echo. The chattering intensified slightly, now accompanied by a faint, high-pitched whimpering. It sounded like a child, a small child, lost and freezing. My blood ran cold, far colder than the air in the room. This wasn't the wind. A faint bluish light began to emanate from the corner of the room, near the old mahogany wardrobe. It was a soft glow, like moonlight filtered through ice, and in its ethereal illumination, a figure began to coalesce. It was small, pathetically small, a child. No older than 8, maybe 9. Its skin was the color of a winter sky, mottled with shades of purplish blue. Its lips were chapped and cracked, and its eyes, wide and staring, were milky white like ice marbles. Wisps of pale, almost translucent hair framed its face, and a thin, threadbare shirt hung loosely on its emaciated frame. The frost-smitten child, it stood there, shivering visibly, its small hands clasped together, rubbing furiously as if trying to generate warmth. The chattering teeth sound was now clearly coming from its mouth. An endless, desperate tremor. My breath hitched. I wanted to scream, to pull myself away, to throw something at it, anything to make it disappear. But my body, a cruel betrayer, remained rooted to the bed, only my eyes able to move, tracking the chilling apparition. The child took a step forward, its bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. Another step. Its gaze, those milky white eyes, was fixed on me. There was no malice in them, only in profound, endless sorrow and a harrowing cold. It radiated a chill that seemed to penetrate my very soul. It continued to advance, slowly, inexorably. The temperature in the room plummeted further, the air so cold it burned my lungs with every shallow breath. I could see my own exhaled breath hanging thick in the air, a fleeting ghost of my terror. As the child drew closer to the foot of my bed, a thin layer of frost began to spread across the floorboards in its wake. It was a tangible trail of its despair, sparkling in the faint blue light. The whimpering grew louder, more pained, like a constant soft cry that chipped away at my sanity. It stopped at the foot of the bed, its face level with my shins. Its small, frozen hands slowly, painfully slowly, began to rise. My eyes were locked on it, every nerve ending screaming. I knew, with an absolute certainty, that if that icy hand touched me, I would cease to exist. Not die, but simply freeze out of reality. The hand moved, inches from my blanketed feet. The cold emanating from it was unbearable, a physical pressure against my skin. I could feel the hairs on my legs bristling. Despite the paralysis, the whimpering reached a crescendo, a sound of such pure, desolate misery that it ripped at something deep inside me. Just as its fingers were about to brush the blanket, a faint, almost imperceptible glow began to appear outside my window. The first hint of dawn. The child froze. Its head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only it could hear. The blue light surrounding it began to dim, flickering like a dying candle. The chattering and whimpering softened, then faded entirely. As quickly as it had appeared, the child began to dissipate, its form blurring, melting back into the shadows. The frost on the floor receded, leaving only the dull gleam of the polished wood. The icy chill in the room began to lift, slowly, painfully slowly, replaced by the faint warmth of the approaching morning. By the time the first rays of the sun pierced through the gap in my curtains, the child was gone. The room was still cold, but no longer arctic. The silence was still heavy, but now without the mournful whimpering. I lay there, utterly spent, my body trembling uncontrollably despite the returning warmth. My teeth chattered, mirroring the ghosts. My mind, however, was terrifyingly clear. It hadn't been a dream. It hadn't been my imagination. The house was haunted, and this, I instinctively knew, was only the beginning. Day 9. The next morning, Julianne arrived to find me pale, sweat-soaked, and on the verge of hysteria. She took my temperature, checked my vitals, and looked at me with increasing concern. "Mr. Jacobs, are you feeling all right? You look like you haven't slept a wink," she said, her gentle voice a stark contrast to the terror of the night. It's cold, Julianne. So cold last night," I managed to croak, the words tasting like ash. She touched my forehead. "You don't have a fever. The thermostat says the room was a steady 72 all night." I closed my eyes, defeated. How could I explain a frost-smitten child? She'd think I was delirious. The dietitian arrived then, her usual brisk demeanor unchanged, and soon I was subjected to the indignity of being fed lukewarm oatmeal, my stomach churning with residual fear. The day passed in a haze of apprehension. Every shadow seemed to shift, every creak of the house made me jump. I kept the TV off, terrified of what it might show me, or what might turn it on. I tried to reason with myself, to convince myself that the child was a hallucination, brought on by my medications, by my trauma. But deep down I knew, the cold, the terror, the lingering sensation of absolute despair. It had been real. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of bruised purple and angry orange, the fear coiled tighter in my gut. Night was coming again. This time, the haunting began differently. It wasn't a drop in temperature, but a scent. A cloying metallic aroma that began to fill the room, subtle at first, then growing stronger. The smell of blood, Not fresh, vibrant blood, but old, congealed, decaying blood. And something else, something sharp and acrid, like cheap disinfectant trying to mask a terrible truth. Then came the sound. Not chattering, but a soft, wet thump. Then another. And another. A sickening rhythm that seemed to be moving across the floor, just outside my bedroom door. It was the sound of something heavy and soft being dragged, then dropped, then dragged again. My breath caught in my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperately wishing for the silence, for the benign creaks of an old house. But the sounds persisted, growing louder, closer. Thump. Drag. Thump. The metallic scent was overwhelming now, stinging my nostrils, making my stomach clench. Then, a new sound began to intertwine with the wet thumps, a soft, almost imperceptible gurgling. It was a choked, rasping sound, as if someone was trying to speak but was drowning in their own fluids. A sound of final, suffocating agony. The door to my bedroom, which I had sworn I'd locked, slowly, silently, began to open. I watched, mesmerized by a horror that rendered me incapable of even blinking. The crack widened. Through the gap, a form began to appear. Not a whole form. First, a bloody hand slid through the opening, fingers splayed and unnaturally bent. It was a woman's hand, delicate despite the grime and dried gore, but severed cleanly at the wrist. It twitched, as if still alive, still searching for something to grasp. Then, slowly, a forearm followed, also severed, slick with blackish red. It moved, somehow propelling itself forward, followed by an upper arm, then a shoulder, then the mangled remains of a torso, twisted and rent open, exposing ruined viscera. The dismembered woman. She was not whole, but a grotesque, living puzzle of body parts, each piece moving independently yet drawn together by some invisible, horrific force. A leg, torn raggedly at the hip, dragged itself into the room, then another leg, followed by a foot, ankle still adorned with a delicate silver chain that glinted dully in the dim light. There was no head, only a torso, a pair of arms, and a pair of legs, each segment dripping phantom fluids onto my pristine floor, leaving trails of black ichor that shimmered like oil. The gurgling sound was coming from the torso, a wet, desperate noise that spoke of lungs filled with blood, a throat brutally torn. The pieces assembled themselves, slowly, painfully, into a macabre approximation of a human form at the foot of my bed. The torso stood upright, impossibly, on its own mangled base, arms dangling. The severed head, when it finally rolled into the room from the hallway, landed with a soft, sickening squelch on the floor beside the assembled body. It was a beautiful face, even in death. Long, dark hair matted with blood, eyes wide open, staring sightlessly at the ceiling. The mouth was a dark, gaping wound, from which the faint gurgling sounds now emanated directly. The head slowly, agonizingly, began to float upwards, rising from the floor like a morbid helium balloon, until it reattached itself to the mangled neck of the torso with a sound like tearing meat. Now she was complete. A tall, gaunt woman, naked and terribly disfigured, stood at the foot of my bed. Her eyes, now in place, fixed on me. They were not milky like the child's, but wide and black with a terrible, unseeing rage. She did not move her limbs. Instead, she swayed slightly, unnaturally, from side to side, and then from her reattached throat came a sound. Not the gurgling, but a long, drawn-out, utterly blood-curdling scream. It was a sound that tore through the air, that vibrated in my teeth, that clawed at the inside of my skull, a scream of pure, unadulterated agony and betrayal. It was the last sound of a life brutally extinguished, amplified 1,000 times. I clamped my hands over my ears, desperate to block it out, but the sound pierced through my palms, resonated in my bones. My head throbbed, my eyes watered, my entire body convulsed with a fear that went beyond anything I had ever known. The scream lasted for an eternity, rising and falling in waves of unbearable torment. The metallic scent intensified, choking me, making me gag. I could feel warm tears streaming down my face, tears of terror and helplessness. Just as I thought my eardrums would burst, as my mind teetered on the brink of shattering, the scream abruptly cut off. The dismembered woman stood silent, her mangled body swaying, her black eyes still fixed on mine. The profound silence that followed was almost worse than the scream, pregnant with unspoken horrors. Then, slowly, agonizingly, she began to disassemble. Her head detached first, floating downwards with a soft whoosh until it rested on the floor. Then an arm cleanly severing from the shoulder, falling with a wet thump. Then a leg, dropping like a sack of potatoes. One by one, the parts of her body fell away, collapsing onto the floor with sickening wet sounds. The metallic stench gradually lessened, the black ichor on the floor slowly fading from view. By the time the first birds began their hesitant chirping outside my window, by the time the gray light of dawn began to seep into the room, there was nothing left but the oppressive, lingering smell of blood and the phantom echo of a woman's final, agonizing scream. I lay there, shivering, gasping for air, my throat raw from silent screams, my ears ringing with the echo of her torment. The frost-smitten child had been mild, a chilling prelude. This was a direct assault, a violation of my senses, a brutal reminder of my utter powerlessness. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me far more than any spectral cold, that the worst was yet to come. The third presence, the gouged-eyed man, I had glimpsed the true nature of pure, visceral evil, and it was waiting for me. The story continues with the final, most brutal haunting of the gouged-eyed man. Day 10. The Gouged-Eyed Man. I didn't sleep at all on the second night. I lay rigid, every muscle in my neck and shoulders seized, my eyes scanning the room, begging the morning light to arrive. When Julianne and the dietitian came, they found me near collapse, but physically, there was nothing wrong. No blood, no lingering metallic scent, no frost, just the profound internal damage of absolute terror. Julianne tried to be helpful, offering to call a therapist, but I couldn't bring myself to speak the truth. How do you tell someone you are being tormented by 3 different ghosts, one of whom just reassembled herself piece by horrifying piece? I simply shook my head and whispered that I was in pain. As the sun began its inevitable descent, painting the western sky in hues of red and deepening purple, a sense of crushing dread settled over me. This was it, the final, heaviest footfall. The third ghost. The one I knew would not be content with merely chilling or screaming. This one, I was certain, was here to end me. This time, the haunting began with sound and shadow. The air didn't cool. It grew heavy, suffocating, like being submerged in thick oil. The scent wasn't blood, but a foul, visceral mix of stale sweat, stale liquor, and something burnt, like singed hair and meat. It was the stench of a brutal, messy death. Then came the sound of heavy, deliberate pacing in the hallway, the same sound that had heralded the invisible audience 2 days prior. Thump. Drag. Thump. It was the sound of a large, enraged man walking slowly, enjoying the weight of his own violence. A deep, inhuman growling started, a sound of guttural frustration and pain that emanated from the hall. It wasn't a word, just pure, animalistic malice. The shadow was the first thing to enter the room, a massive, misshapen darkness that blotted out the light under the door, then stretched up the wall, dancing menacingly. When the door slowly creaked open, the gouged-eyed man stepped inside. He was huge, a mountain of dark shadow dressed in what looked like heavy work clothes, a stained denim jacket and thick trousers. But it was his face, or lack thereof, that arrested my breath and locked me in a silent scream. His eyes were gone, not just closed, but brutally gouged out, leaving twin black cavernous sockets from which a thick dark fluid slowly weeped. His mouth was stretched into a permanent silent snarl, his tongue cut out and replaced by a ragged, pulsing void. And finally, the source of the stench. A long, black-handled knife was buried deep into his chest, the handle jutting out from his sternum, his throat slit open in a gaping dark red wound that looked like a second monstrous mouth. He was the very definition of visceral torment, a walking, breathing wound. He didn't scream or shiver. He simply stood, radiating a potent, pure hatred. The growling was coming from the deep, gaping slit in his throat, a constant, low rumble that shook the air. He took a slow, heavy step into the room. Unlike the others, he did not stop at the foot of the bed. He began to move around the perimeter, his heavy step shaking the floorboards. I tracked his movement with my eyes, terror a cold, sharp point in my spine. He was circling me, slowly, deliberately, like a predator with cornered prey. He reached the window, paused, and slowly, laboriously, dragged a massive, black-stained hand across the glass, leaving a sickening smear. He reached the wardrobe, and with a grunt that felt like a physical blow, he slammed his fist into the wood. The heavy mahogany cracked with an audible snap. He was moving closer to my head. The silent plea in my mind was a desperate, chaotic roar. "Help me! Please, just make it stop." The man stopped directly beside my bed. His gruesome, eyeless face hovered inches from mine. The stench of burnt meat and gore was overwhelming, a suffocating cloud. I could feel the heat radiating from him, not the warmth of life, but the dry, intense heat of rage. He slowly, agonizingly raised his right hand. It was enormous, thick, and scarred. He did not touch me. Instead, he reached down to the knife handle still buried in his own chest. his massive fingers wrapped around the slick, black grip. Then, with a sound of ripping flesh and a guttural, choked roar that erupted from his slit throat, he began to rotate the knife. The sheer, agonizing sound of the blade turning inside his corpse was more than my nerves could bear. The sound was high, wet, and tearing, and it was coupled with a sound I couldn't place, a frantic, high-pitched wail that seemed to be trapped somewhere inside his ravaged chest. His eyeless sockets wept a dark, thick fluid that splattered onto my face, stinging my eyes. The force of the act made his whole body convulse, shaking my bed with monstrous strength. He did this for an eternity, twisting the knife, his body rattling with silent, endless pain. And then, he slowly, impossibly began to withdraw the knife. The scraping sound of metal against bone, the tearing of tissue, was the most hideous noise I had ever heard. The blade emerged, slick and crimson, held high in his fist, the gaping wound in his chest a shocking cavern of blackness. He leaned in, his foul breath washing over my face. He slowly, carefully, extended the knife toward my chest. I closed my eyes, a final, despairing tear escaping. This was it. The culmination of the terror. The final brutal act. I couldn't move. I could only wait for the cold steel to pierce my flesh, to end this nightmare. The last sound I heard, just before the impact, was the growl, now close enough to feel the vibration on my skin, followed by a sudden, sickening lunge. The morning revelation, the first light of dawn, always carried salvation. But on this morning, it merely illuminated the horror. Julianne arrived precisely at 8 a.m. She walked into the room, her usual cheerful greeting dying on her lips. Mr. Jacobs lay utterly lifeless in his bed. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, frozen in a mask of absolute visceral fear and despair. His mouth was agape in a silent scream. But what truly horrified Julianne was not the expression, but the strange markings on the bedsheets. A large, circular scorch mark where the gouged-eyed man had stood, and 3 faint, icy trails leading away from the bed. As she fumbled for her phone, her hand shaking violently to call the police, the television in the corner of the room, still dark from the night, suddenly snapped on. The screen burst to life, displaying the urgent news report. The city's brutal serial killer has claimed his 3rd victim in as many weeks, a tragic escalation in the unsolved case of the Lynch family murders. The report flashed a picture on the screen. It was an old photograph, slightly faded, showing a happy family of 3. A young woman, a man, and a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, being carried in his father's arms. The news anchor continued, somber and grave. Asterisk police are now revealing shocking new information. The victims found over the last 3 weeks, the mother, the dismembered woman, the father, the gouged-eyed, throat-slit man, and the frozen child, have all been identified as members of the same family, brutally murdered and disposed of years ago. The killer was never caught, and his whereabouts remain unknown. The picture on the screen changed. First, a close-up of the little boy, his eyes milky and blue in the old photo, the frost-smitten child. Next, a close-up of the mother, her vibrant smile, a cruel irony against her fate. The dismembered woman. Then, a close-up of the father, the knife wound on his torso obscured by his arm in the photo, the gouged-eyed man. The screen split. On one side was the family photo. On the other, dominating the frame, was a large, police-issued photograph of a man with a tired, distant gaze. It was Mr. Jacobs. Across his picture, a bold black banner flashed repeatedly. Serial killer on the loose, primary suspect in Lynch family murders. Julianne, standing over the dead, fear-stricken body of Mr. Jacobs, let out a piercing scream as she finally understood. The man in the bed hadn't been a victim of a random haunting. He had been the murderer, paralyzed and confined, trapped for 3 days with the vengeful ghost of the family he had slaughtered, who had returned not to frighten, but to extract their slow, meticulous, and agonizing justice.
Like and subscribe to my channel for more chilling tales.